And for the next panel discussion, we will talk about the economic sustainability, and I would like to invite Princess Mashal Al-Sha'lan to moderate this session.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'm quite happy to see that there's still some people who are engaged and in the room, so thank you for that. Maybe I'll start with a bit of a talk, because I know one of our speakers unfortunately could not make it. He had COVID, so I'll take the liberty of maybe framing the topic a bit in the beginning. So for decades, Saudis populated corners of what seemed at times challenging and inhospitable lands. This created more resilient, more sustainable, more community-centric people. Somewhere along the way, we might have diverged, but we have an opportunity to learn the wealth of knowledge that our ancestors had. With a quick growth fueled by our hydrocarbon-generated wealth and ingenuity, we continue to thrive for now, albeit at a harsher climate, more freshwater-constrained system, with an average increase in temperatures within the Arabian Peninsula of 3.1 degrees C, as one of our brilliant students at KAUST, Natalia, has calculated, compared to an average from 1979 to date. Yet we are in a unique intersection in Saudi Arabia. We have hydrocarbon sources that are relatively cleaner and more economically extractable and turnable into resources with the frameworks like that of the circular carbon economy. We're equally one generation removed from a resilient and a considerate way of life. And we're in the midst of sustained leadership, ambitious projects, committed youth, as we're seeing today, as well as bold national ambitions and targets. This unique opportunity endows us with a potential to navigate very turbulent planetary resource-constrained world. We owe it to ourselves and future generations to collectively chart a more sustainable and a stable pathway forward, more equitable, more just pathway forward. So focusing on the well-being of generations of the future, but not forgetting the well-being of today's generations. I'm honored to share a panel of speakers that have been thinking quite deeply over the past few decades about how do you fit 7 billion humans on a planet with finite resources or inputs, while limiting risk and spreading holistic well-being to both us and ecosystems around us. Our speaker that couldn't make it for today, day one of COVID, but we have some registered notes from him, is Professor Joshua Farley, who's an ecological economist and professor in community development and applied economics and public administration. We have Professor Tad, who's a professor here at KAUST of petroleum and chemical engineering at the Earth Sciences Division, and director of the Ali Al-Aimi Petroleum Engineering Center in KAUST, as well as Dr. Nate Higgins, who's the director of the Institute of the Study of the Energy and Our Futures. So what are we talking about right now? And hi, nice to see you guys. Tad, I hope you're feeling okay. I know you're nursing COVID as well, but you're day 3, so we thank you for joining us as well. So before we jump to the pre-recorded presentation, where our speakers will walk us through how they view the problem, I have one ask. This might be a bit of a tall order since we're at the end of a very long day, and some of our speakers are joining remotely in this case, but I invite you, as I invite myself, to actively listen, challenge, and critically think about some of the notions that they will put forth. After our discussion, you have, as we've seen before, there are 2 mics on these sides for us to engage with. So please keep an ear open and let's jump in. So without further ado, our pre-recorded problem-focused video.
Hello, everybody. I'm honored that you've invited me to speak to you today on the economics of sustainability. I'm thrilled to learn that Saudi youth care about sustainability because it's obvious that too few people from my generation care enough. And I'm impressed that you've chosen the topic of thriving together, because only through collective action and cooperation are we going to be able to develop a sustainable future. I don't want to sugarcoat things here. If we continue with business as usual of an economic system fueled by fossil energy and striving for endless economic growth, we're going to cause so much damage to our global ecosystems that it will force radical change on our economic systems as a best case scenario. Our alternative is to radically, intentionally change our systems proactively to mitigate our ecological damage and give us time to adapt to the ecological change that's already inevitable and underway. So radical change seems like a difficult situation to face. But if we put this into perspective, economies are evolutionary systems and have continually undergone radical change to deal with the problems we confront. Hunter-gatherers, we evolved as hunter-gatherers 250,000 years ago during the Pleistocene epoch, which was characterized by extreme environmental change, driven by extreme climate change. Not only did humans survive, but we thrived, not because of our individual prowess. At any time in human history, if you put an individual out in the environment, apart from their culture, apart from the shared collective cultural knowledge, we would starve to death or be eaten in a remarkably short period of time. But collectively, we were able, with Stone Age technologies, to populate 6 continents and almost every viable ecosystem. About 10,000 years ago, our economy, our ecosystem, the climate became remarkably stable. This allowed for the evolution of agriculture. Agriculture allowed denser human populations. It allowed us to produce more surplus, to expand our populations, but also required economic change. We needed divisions of labor. We needed private property rights, things that we hadn't had before. 250 years ago, an even bigger change occurred, arguably, which was the advent of the fossil fuel economy. We tapped in the stored stocks of solar energy that we could extract and use as fast as we liked. This coincided with the advent of the market economy. Markets are based on private property rights, individual choice, competition, and the profit motive. Fossil fuels fit well into this. If I burn a barrel of oil, you can't, we're competing, unavoidable. Private property rights are simple. We can buy and sell, trade fossil fuels in the market. Seems like a good match for the market economy. The problem is the costs of fossil fuel use are collective while the benefits are individual. We need to collectively manage those costs. Unfortunately, the costs did not become apparent until fairly recently in human history. In the meantime, we developed many other institutions to expand cooperation, or coordination, I should say. So the monetary economy allowed us to coordinate economic activity with people around the world we neither knew nor trusted, expanding the market to the planet as a whole. All of us today are wearing items that were produced around the world. So this was a new expansion of cooperation, coordination activity, but only for market goods and services. More recently, we have entered into the era of explosive growth in technologies and knowledge. We can now share information at the speed of light around the planet. Information is very different than energy. Information improves through use. The more you share my ideas, the better they get. If we develop clean, green technologies, I can share them with Saudi Arabia or China, and they would come back to me better when the scientists there improve them. So suddenly it becomes very obvious that cooperation is necessary to achieve the solutions to many of the problems we currently face. But unfortunately, we have relied on market economies and competition for resources to ration access to energy as well, which is kind of ridiculous because, as you can imagine, any green technology we develop, its value is maximized at a price of zero when the maximum number of people can use it. If we had a clean, decentralized, cheap alternative to fossil fuels that didn't require rare earths, that required abundant, which is kind of ridiculous because, as you can imagine, any green technology we develop, its value is maximized at a price of zero when the maximum number of people can use it. If we had a clean, decentralized, cheap alternative to fossil fuels that didn't require rare earths, that required abundant, which is kind of ridiculous because, as you can imagine, any green technology we develop, its value is maximized at a price of zero when the maximum number of people can use it. If we had a clean, decentralized, cheap alternative to fossil fuels that didn't require rare earths, that required abundant, which is kind of ridiculous because, as you can imagine, any green technology we develop, its value is maximized at a price of zero when the maximum number of people can use it. If we had a clean, decentralized, cheap alternative to fossil fuels that didn't require rare earths, that required abundant, which is kind of ridiculous because, as you can imagine, any green technology we develop, its value is maximized at a price of zero.
It seems like the system is more tired than the humans, so let's give it a few seconds. Okay, so sorry about that. Then maybe I'll go to the main points or the main takeaways that essentially Joshua had. What he was mentioning at the end of this was the need for radical, intentional, and proactive change to the economic systems to mitigate ecological damage and also give time to adapt to the inevitable change underway. So maybe we can go directly to the conversation, and I don't know if we can have both Tad and Nate join us. Hi, Tad. I hope you're up for it. And you're muted, I think.
I'm not muted.
Okay, there we go. Fantastic. So do you want to give a bit of a preview around some of the key concepts that you've spoken about in the video? Where do you see the problem happening, in essence?
Well, in the essence of the problem, and probably not everybody will like what I'll say, is the number of humans having more and more needs and wants. What I would have shown in my little video would have been a curve of growth of human population with time over the last 3,500 years. And it turns out that for the first 2,100 or 2,600 years, the human population was remarkably constant, varying, in bad times between 200 million up to 500 million during antiquity, and then varying with each epidemic and pandemic during medieval times, which were not so good for humans. And then come 1650, there was a marked change in the slope of growth of the population, which then was remarkably constant until 1920 or so. That break in the change of slope was caused by agricultural and industrial revolution, but also by the opening of the world through the discovery and conquest of South and North America, which essentially doubled the size of the world for humans. And so if we were to extrapolate that trend and assume that humans could draw conclusions, then the human population would saturate at about 2.5 billion people today. Well, in reality, it is 8 billion people today, and it's going up, perhaps to 11 billion people in a few decades. But that would require us to live at the, let's say, 1830, 1820 standard of living and the duration of human life. So I make a few arguments and calculations which show that if we want to stick with today's duration of life, about 71 years as opposed to 37 in 1830s, and if we want to avoid conflict and strife, then perhaps our planet could handle 1 billion people in a peaceful and sustainable way, driven by very strong green agriculture. And so by that standard, we have overshot by a factor of 8. And therefore, we need to start drawing conclusions, because every other aspect of our life, energy consumption, materials consumption, is driven by the number of humans, and they are growing out of bounds, which cannot be maintained by a finite planet. I will leave you at that and will invite you to a further discussion, because the subject is vast and I cannot possibly exhaust it in 5 minutes.
Thank you very much for that, Tad. So Nate, I know you've had really cool slides about how we're energy blind. Could you further elaborate on that and a bit of how you see this problem emerging in terms of growth?
Hi, Mashael. I actually have the slides here. It would probably be easier for me to actually do them live. Would that make sense?
That would have been ideal, but I think they had a technical problem with that as well. But
No, I can do it live right now.
Feel free to do so if you can.
Okay, let me try that.
Oh, I wish I understood this, then I would have shared my slides.
I didn't understand that either, so that makes two of us, Tad. Go ahead.
Yeah, can you see this?
Yes.
We can see your notes as well.
Okay, so I'm going to talk briefly. First of all, greetings to you all. Salam alaikum. I was in that room a few years ago, and I know where you're watching me from. And I will just say one thing that I felt when I was at KAUST is all of the young people that are studying there from around the Middle East, from around the world, I felt this collegiality of humans from different countries arriving to study and learn about our planet, about our situation in one place. And it gave me this hope for humanity. You don't get that at universities around the world that I felt at KAUST. So you guys are, and women are lucky to be there and have that spirit of humanity. So let me briefly go through my talk about the human ecosystem. If you look at the second derivative, no, I'm just kidding. The human ecosystem simplified. We invent technology that combines labor, energy, and resources into products, and we create monetary representations for them, dollars, euros, reals, and we generate feelings and impacts and waste. So we do this every year, every quarter, and we repeat it, and this is called GDP, or growth. So I'm going to just briefly focus on this energy, labor, materials part. We need energy for every economic activity that contributes to GDP. We need energy to invent, to create, to run, to maintain, to fix, to dispose of every aspect in our economies. So this is predicated on a large amount of fossil hydrocarbons. Shown here is me, and I can do the work of 1/10 of a horse. Shown here is my horse, Binga, who does the work of 1 horse. In the middle is my utility vehicle, which can do the work of 45 horses. And that is my truck, which with a little bit of diesel fuel can do the work of 300 horses. And an airplane flying across the sky, you could imagine 100,000 invisible horses pulling it across the sky. All of these things are possible because a barrel of oil contains 1,760 kilowatt hours worth of human work potential, which takes the average human around 4 to 5 years of physical labor to accomplish. So if you consider the 100 billion barrel of oil equivalents that we use every year, that ends up being the labor equivalent of around 500 billion humans, shown here as Professor Tad. And that is in contrast to 5 billion real human workers. So we are unbelievably supported by these workers that we take for granted. This has resulted in increased wages, increased profits, a reduction in the price of things, and a boost in the number of people, as Tad said, and the economic output or benefits per person. Right now, the human economy is 1,000 times bigger than it was 500 years ago. Now, what people don't often realize is they attribute our success to technology without realizing how connected our economic growth is to energy and materials. The orange line in this graph shows the global economic growth for the last 50 years. And the purple line is the material footprint, how much energy and materials we need. Energy and GDP are 99% correlated. We get a little bit more efficient over time, but everything we need requires energy. Materials and GDP are 100% correlated. Everything that generates GDP is a 1-for-1 relationship with materials like copper or phosphorus or silicone. So oil for now explains our economy. This is a logarithmic chart. On the bottom, we show oil consumption, and on the left axis, we show GDP for the countries in the world. And you can see that the correlation is almost 1-for-1. It's a 0.96 R² between oil and GDP. Given KAUST's focus on technology, I wanted to briefly talk about the relationship between technology and energy. So there's two types of technology. The first type is things that make our current energy more efficient, or a new technology that invents solar voltaic or geothermal or something like that. The other type of technology is replacing things that humans used to do manually with fossil hydrocarbon energy, or new things like Facebook or cell phones or things that humans never had before. Both of these types of type 2 technology end up increasing human demand for more energy. And so technology often just acts as a vector to increase future demands on energy. Technology without energy is merely a sculpture. We are energy blind because our economic leaders and our politicians have a story where it's a circular economy that goes from households demand things, firms build the things and deliver them to households, and this whole thing is a virtuous circle. But this explanation is energy blind because it ignores the source of all this wealth, which is coming from the natural world, and the sink, which we don't pay for the costs of pollution and the growing amount of CO2 in our oceans and our biosphere. So as a society, our research has shown that we conflate the dollar value of energy with the work value of energy. And we don't include the cost of pollution at all. We are energy blind. And in a long-term standpoint, if you look at a bird's eye view of 20,000 years, we are somewhere between the blue star and the red star during the carbon pulse, where our civilizations are organized around this ancient sunlight, which we are pulling out of the ground 10 million times faster than it was sequestered. But our stories say that this is sustainable, but we are in effect drawing down the principle, but treating it in our media, in our political discussions, as if it were interest. So the good news is we don't need lots more energy to have well-being and good lifestyles. Once we have around 100 gigajoules per capita, shown here as Turkey and China, our human development index kind of levels out, and adding a lot more energy per person per country doesn't really increase our development a lot. There is a cap. So just my key points to briefly summarize, since I went very fast. Energy is the currency of life and underpins all we do in human systems. Human societies get the labor equivalent of around 500 billion workers, mostly from fossil hydrocarbons. Technology is mostly a vector for more energy use, and technology without energy is merely a sculpture. It's inanimate. Modern economic theory is flawed. We only account for the cost of extraction of the main input to our economies, not the cost of its creation, nor its pollution. We are all alive today, midway during the carbon pulse, and our global culture misunderstands the importance of energy to our lives and to our futures. We are energy blind.
Thank you very much for that, Nate. And maybe then I can restart the questions with you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So at the risk of restating what you've just said, you clearly highlighted the importance of energy in our society. Like you said, our iPhones without energies are sculptures, and I would like to argue they're paperweights. You've also dubbed our culture as energy blind, getting our low entry resources from the environment and dumping our waste back into the environment, equally conflating the dollar value of energy for the work value of energy with no costs factored in for the pollution. So to restate this simply, modern economics theory is flawed. How do you propose we address this?
Well, I know a lot of economists who would disagree with what I've just said, because economists think that our wealth is a product of capital and labor. And so they've been inventing descriptions of why we're so wealthy the last 50 or 100 years. And over time, those descriptions no longer include energy and materials. So it's a very hard discussion to have. I think what's happening in the global macroeconomy right now cannot easily be explained by conventional economic thinking. I think we probably have to have a crisis where people realize we've been following the wrong playbook, and then new ideas come. How do we fix the economic system? Well, we're paying the wrong prices. We're paying pennies for something that is incredibly valuable. And so over time, to have a tax on non-renewable inputs and potentially would lead to the right type of innovation and conservation of these resources. But politically, that's very difficult, because to tax things when people are in a tough economic situation is not popular. But it would give us the better signals, for example, the engineers and brilliant minds at KAUST, to invent products and processes more aligned with the more realistic future path, which is unlikely to be one of growth, but one of maybe flat or declining economic output.
If I may push you a bit further on this question of tax, because you're right to point out the political difficulty of pushing something like this. I think the word tax is something that economists would agree on. It's the easiest way to make their models make sense. But we recall, for example, Janet Yellen going on the premise that putting a tax on carbon would be the way to go until Janet Yellen was in office, right? So how would you essentially go at it? I mean, it would be very difficult to tell people, educate yourself enough about the complexity of the problem, it will be painful, but it's needed, when in reality there's this intergenerational equity question of how do you ensure the growth and the well-being of people today in order to preserve and ensure a being in the future.
Well, I may defer to Professor Patzik on that, but I will say that we have a lot of equity issues. There are the equity issues between people in a country. There's the equity issues between countries, between the global north and the global south. There are equity issues between generations because future generations won't have this access to fossil carbon and hydrocarbons like we've had. There's also equity issues between species. We've lost 80% of the vertebrate animals in the world since I was born. So we are encroaching on other species ecosystems, and they're not even considered in our economic decisions. Princess, I don't have the answer to that question because we have to weigh the pros and cons of all these things. But I think it's important to first understand the game board that we're on. And economists look at money and technology when Tad and I and our other colleagues look at resources, ecosystems as the fundamental building block of civilization and human societies.
Yeah, I thank you for that answer. I think it's extremely important to highlight the need, the complexities of our systems, but also decision-making going into the process. A lot of the narratives that are generally told to our youth is quite simplistic. It's an either-or kind of scenario. It's an either a scenario of this is complex, you need to not do anything about it, and it gets to a point where it, some mental health issues associated with it. But on the flip side, an overly simplistic model where with the playing and tweaking of a bit of the metrics, you see a more idealized world without a proper consideration for the social, the economic, and the socioeconomic dynamics and implications on one hand, let alone any of the geopolitical, exactly to your point that this is not only inequality that's happening between different generations, between different members of, economies within a certain country, but it's also between different geographies across the globe. So Tad, maybe if you wanted to reflect quickly on this before I jump into a tougher question on populations.
Sure. As Nate said, we need to realize on which board, on which plane we currently are. And once we understand where we are, we have a GPS and we understand in which directions we may or may not go, which is what science tells us, in particular thermodynamics tells us, that certain directions are not feasible, are impossible to go into. We will then understand better what we may or may not be able to do. The young people in the audience or listening to us will also have children, of which we will speak soon, no doubt. And they need to realize that this inequity Nate has mentioned will continue. And so our task is to lessen the inequalities and inequities which are present everywhere. I will add to one more thing. A modern society is like a living superorganism. It lives and is self-organized because of giant flows of energy through it. You take out the flow of energy, the society simplifies. So we also need to understand that with lesser flows of energy through a society, we will have to deal with simpler societies. And we will have to make sure that these simpler societies still remain equitable, provide proper education to the young ones, and try to preserve themselves so they can exist for some generations into the future. This is no simple task, and currently this task is further complicated by the climate change, which, by the way, to a huge extent is human caused. So we have a monkey wrench, a wild card in the system, which will cause all kinds of other difficulties with water supply, food supply, energy supply, and will cause disruptions in international trade and wars, as we are witnessing now with the war in Ukraine. So again, I will close now because I will be most happy to answer questions, not just pontificate.
Then maybe to your point, and if I may push a bit further on the question of population growth, I like to think of it as the biggest threat multiplier. Climate is a big threat multiplier, but in the case of how you framed it, population growth is the cause of climate change. Climate change is a symptom of the growth in populations, and this is how you've been framing it. You also state that based on the estimates that we've had, we would have seen slides of, is that we're above a factor of 8, above in terms of an overshoot of what our globe can carry in terms of populations. And this is greatly due to the subsidies in fossil fuels, as well as eliminating most important ecosystems on the planet. It just got me thinking around Herman Daly and some of the 3 conditions of sustainability when there was this new movement towards creating a new form of economics, that of environmental economics. The 3 main conditions for sustainability is to extract Earth's renewable sources no faster than Earth can generate them. The second is dump pollution and waste in Earth's sinks no faster than they can assimilate them or make them harmless. And the third is to use non-renewable resources no faster than you can find substitutes. So this is quite complex, and I think particularly the issue of population and population change and demographic is equally associated with a lot of bad history tied to colonialism and population controls among many countries around the world. It's also a very sensitive topic. I think in a lot of places we've seen potentially a correlation where when the more educated populations are, the fewer children they're having over longer periods of time. But we're talking here about exponential impact. So the problem with this power of the logarithmic is that it continues to be exponential, irrespective of what that rate of exponential growth is. So how do you propose to address this very complex overshoot, and particularly with a focus on maintaining a just and equitable transition? I think this question, and particularly to our youth that are in the room, that are maybe some of them starting to hear some of these concepts, how do you not despair, and how can we vision a pathway forward?
Well, as they say, reality is what it is, regardless of what I say about it. My proposed solution to this problem is to allow people to have, depending on the society in which they live, around 2 children. Sometimes 2.1 child on average, sometimes 1.9 child on average. So essentially, 2 children or straight reproduction is supported by the state, by the society. If you want to have more children, then increasingly they will be on you. That is the cost of raising and educating a child will be on you, not being borne by the society. I think that's a very simple economic argument to make people aware that there are costs of bringing a child into the world. And in fact, our colleague calculated that on average worldwide, 1 child is a tax of 75,000 kilowatt hours of primary energy on the planet. And that's not in the United States, it's 10 times more. So we will have to weigh the benefits and the penalties of growing the population in an era in which the population may not have water to drink, food to eat, and facilities to educate their children and simply to live, because we will be increasingly living in an air-conditioned environment because of the climate change. So I think the young people, one way or another, understand this today probably better than we do. And certainly the people I talk to understand this quite well. Nate, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I have a complementary perspective on Princess Mashayel's question. I think both population and climate change are not the drivers. They are downstream of humans figuring out how to access all this ancient carbon and add it to our economies. And so we have two population problems, right? We have 8 billion humans, but we also have the population of the things that require energy that the humans use. So we have refrigerators and cars and air conditioners and computers. And so there's population of those things and there's population of people. So every year there are 80 million new humans added net to our global population, but there are 100 million new 3,000-pound vehicles added to the global car fleet. So which is the real driver of emissions and ecosystem destruction and energy use? Is it the number of people or is it the amount of consumption per person? The answer is it's both. And as far as your other question, Princess, how do we not despair? We are alive at one of the most wealthy times in history. So a drop in a simplification, as Professor Tad has pointed out, doesn't have to be a disaster. I think there's a very different framework of solutions, or I don't even like the word solutions, I like the word responses, from a government institutional standpoint than from an individual standpoint. From an individual standpoint, that's a different discussion than the one we're having here, but it starts with recognizing that there may be a different economic future ahead, and that to prepare yourself and your community for maybe a simpler, less materialistic lifestyle. And if that doesn't happen, you're still probably better off to not be distracted by all the high technology and high energy sucking devices. So I think the single best thing that a person can do is learn and form community, find friends and like-minded individuals that understand reality and have an enriched life because you're informed by what's going on. I think social capital is the most important thing that one can invest in.
Thank you for that, Nate.
And again, I will build on what Nate just said. This is all great. However, there is this constant throughput of free energy through everything that lives. And we no longer live in concert with the environment, the planet, which means that, I'm sorry to say, that the presence of each human being is a tax on the planet, which then as a feedback causes changes in the environment, decline of other species and climate change. So there are two very different problems. One of very fast growing populations in very poor countries. And the other problem is of not so growing populations or even not growing populations in extremely rich countries, which then increase their per capita energy use de facto by increasing the life standards. So both need to come down. And it is extremely unfair to the poor majority of the planet that the very few very rich countries essentially monopolize most of the resources of the planet. And that's going to change one way or another. So the situation is complex, but I think that if we can treat everybody as an adult, not simplify or oversimplify, not avoid certain topics, however controversial they might be, we would do everybody a favor and we would probably avoid mental stress and breakdowns, because if you can talk about things, you can relate to other human beings, you already are better off. You're building friendships, you are safer, and you are better off. So let's do that maybe.
Okay. Then maybe as I invite people to queue up, if there are any questions to our speakers. I know for some of the notions that you've touched on, it might be a bit controversial. There might be some differing perspectives and points of views. They're equally an issue of, historical rights for growth and a child's right to live. And we've seen some of those maybe associations with population controls in some countries not necessarily be taking up a very positive outcome. So I would love to see if we have any questions in the room, but yeah, please go ahead.
My name is Saita, and I'm a clinical pharmacy student from Princess Noura bint Abdurrahman University. I want to thank you all for all the speakers, Your Royal Highness, Princess Masha'al, doctors. My question is to Professor Higgins. I want to discuss with you the intricacies of the capitalist economic system, as capitalism is based on growth, and this growth is not necessarily good for the environment. How can we motivate companies to adapt a greener framework if it's more economically expensive for them?
Thank you for your question. It is also a complicated issue. A few years ago, I was in this very room talking to members of KAUST about the concept of an economic superorganism, that humans self-organize as families, small businesses, corporations, and nation states to maximize profits, and the profits are linked to energy, which is linked to hydrocarbon energy, which has emissions. This is a self-organizing process that we've built this superorganism as a global culture to maximize earnings. And so capitalism, in my opinion, is downstream from this system-wide access to energy. So corporations are miniature superorganisms. So they are targeted with maximizing shareholder profits. And if you got a green CEO in a corporation that did the right things to protect the environment, to have more equality, to have more sustainable practices, that person would be kicked out by the shareholders because the corporation's goal itself is to maximize profits. In other words, I think the system would need to change before the capitalist growth imperative would go away, and I don't know how to do that. The other issue is that our monetary systems require growth, because when money is created, we don't create the interest, so there's a built-in growth imperative. Tad, you want to add to what I said?
I just wanted to say that in simple words, capitalism and sustainability are incompatible.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Thank you.
Please go ahead.
Hello, my name is Thamir. So I have a question for Dr. Higgins about the energy blindness. So my question is the energy blindness as a result of a miscommunication between the economists and the politicians, or is it fundamentally an economic problem?
Thank you. I think I heard your question. There was a little bit of an echo. Is the energy blindness due to a miscommunication or from an economic problem? I think for the longest time, our economies did this, and so it was easy to predict what the next few years would be. And so originally, the old economists 100, 200 years ago did have land and land productivity as the basis of explaining how our wealth was created. But over time, we grew so fast and we grew so consistently that these biophysical inputs into the economic models kind of fell by the wayside, and it eventually was just labor and capital. And so I think we were blind to this because for the last 50, 60 years, it's just been a one-way street up. And so economists weren't wrong per se, they were just describing the wrong equations that led to our success. But now, to say the truth that Professor Tad and I are trying to articulate today is very politically difficult to say, oh, our growth and wealth are due to finite resources and we need to save those for future generations. Then there will be some economists that have their status at risk, and it's a very difficult conversation to have. Tad, would you like to add anything to that?
Well, we swim in energy all our lives, like fish swim in water. And most fish don't realize their noses are wet. And we don't realize that we live and die by energy. And so we will have to live a little bit more slowly. That's the key here. And you need to realize it, that the fast living, the fast cars, the Formula 5 are going away. And slower living is coming in.
But not everyone is totally energy blind. The president of my country is coming to visit your country next week. So people do understand the importance of energy.
Most definitely. Please go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum. I am Rawan Turki from King Faisal University, medical student. So the question is, just first I would like to thank you for your inspiring speech. What is the effect that pandemic put on economic sustainability? So is it like good effect or bad effect?
I think the pandemic in early 2020 was a wake-up call to people that something is really complex and we live in a more fragile system than we imagined. I can't speak for other countries because I live in the United States. For a while, people liked the change. It was working less, and they started to realize time in nature and time with family was more important than working so hard to make more money. But I think just like previous crises, it was kind of wasted, and the central banks of the world flooded the world with liquidity, and we went back to kind of our typical pre-COVID consumptive ways. But I think it was a wake-up call to some people in the world that we're going to need to do things differently. Tad, what do you think?
Well, what I think is that I just went to Spain to finish my sabbatical, and I immediately got COVID. And another member of our panel, Professor Joshua Farley, went to Brazil to give a lecture, and he immediately got COVID. So things have changed, and life will not be the same from now on. However, as Nate says, the governments of the world, especially in the rich countries, again, in the rich countries, have done their best to make sure that everything goes back to the old ways. And in fact, our energy consumption is going to reach our new high this year. The CO2 concentration in the air exceeded for the first time 420 ppms, and we are smack on the track to a not very attractive climate scenario, which may result, if we continue on this track, not in 2, but in 4.5 degrees centigrade raise of global temperature on average. Hopefully we'll deviate from this track soon, but if we don't, then our lives will never be the same.
Okay, thank you for that, Tad. Might I inject some maybe non-model or sort of big idea kind of thinking into the process. I think within the space of realism, I think exactly to your point, I mean, I was grabbing my mask to point at this, Tad. I think between very few people within the room are still wearing a mask. I know for a fact that 2 of our speakers have contracted COVID. I know 1 of our potential speakers is going through his 2nd round of COVID. So people's ability to understand and integrate difficulties of decision that are not ground shaking. You're not asking them to restructure their economies. You're not asking them to not have children. You're just asking them to wear a simple mask, right? And they're finding that to be very difficult. I mean, even within the group of the people who are having this conversation right now, who are very well and cognizant of the potential threats, still thought that they were safe enough for a specific point of time to remove said mask, right? So I think within a lot of maybe the thought processes that I like to go through is more onto what's realistic and what's applicable, and less on a pathway that might be the idealized way or the ideal way of dealing with things, or would actually be addressing the root of the problem, but is not aligned at all with how humans function. Our ability to understand complex topics are, very difficult. That's one way to put it. Our ability to get collective decisions on certain hard-to-do decisions are extremely tight and difficult. It's very easy to blame the policymaker when in reality, in a lot of cases, they're responding to the sentiments of the general population. Whether they're guiding it or misguiding it, that's a different topic to discuss. But I think innately within humans' capabilities, we have a very poor ability to understand complexities, to be able to deal with it. And honestly, in a lot of ways, what we call in Arabic, ni'mat al-nisyan, or the blessing of forgetting, you tend to want to forget traumas that you've been through, thinking that I've just gotten through COVID, I'm 1 week out, I'm invincible, I'm Superwoman, right? So how can we inject a bit of realism into this very last point, as I invite you to think of this bigger room as an extension of your students? In a way, how can we inject a bit of realism to these bigger thought ideas that we're pondering together before I wrap up?
Well, dear Mashal, you've asked an incredibly tough question, because humans also respond to crises. And I think that we are now in the epicenter of several crises at the same time. And they are not only co-located, but they are also caused by similar phenomena. The global crisis is climate change, which then causes people to start missing water locally. 45 to 90 million people in Western US may be missing water soon because of the mega drought, a 1,000-year drought, which engulfed a third of the US territory. And of course, that same phenomenon extends to almost entire Northern Africa and many other parts of the world. So that's a very big crisis. Compounding it, there is another crisis of increasing global temperature. So for each day which is cooler than average, you will have 1 and 1.5 or 2 days which are hotter than average. And so life will get less comfortable and sometimes unbearably dangerous, as it is now in Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh, where temperatures can reach 51, 52 degrees centigrade and high humidity, and then you simply die. Compounding this are international tensions and crises, such as now the war in Europe, which has split the world and caused an unbelievable crisis in food supply, especially to Northern Africa and to the Middle East. the Ukrainian grain and parts of the Russian grain, which were feeding a good part of the world, stopped flowing. And that causes huge dislocation and huge crises in many countries. And so I think that people will start responding first to the crisis and adapt to them. I didn't mention the complete lack of fuel in Sri Lanka, and I didn't mention lack of fuel in Laos, and I did not mention huge problems with electricity supply in India, which is a breaking down grid. And so locally, people will have to adapt to the problems which are facing them.
Yeah.
And then they will respond accordingly.
So to say very briefly, sorry to cut you off, Tad, because I'm very cognizant of our time, of everyone who's in the room. But briefly, with one sentence, how do you sum up your sentiment?
See where you are and what are your circumstances and adapt accordingly.
Okay, thank you. Nate?
I'll be brief. I just finished a book by Rebecca Solnit called A Paradise Built in Hell. And it was all about when humans face crises, there's this massive uprising of cooperation, support, camaraderie. And times are tougher, but people work together in unexpected positive ways. And this is happening around the world right now in many places. So my best advice is build knowledge, build skills, and build relationships, and maybe soften your ambition to consume a lot of resources in the future, because you will be more flexible when resources are less available in the future. And good luck and keep learning, everyone.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Maybe then I'll leave everyone here with a final sentence. I think I like to deal, or under Eon Collective and the work that we do on public policy, in the realm of what's possible and less in the realm of what could be, right? Of what's doable. So I challenge everyone who's resilient enough to continue to stay in the room today, to rise to the occasion, to build on the many sets of endowments and catalytic projects and commitments we have in Saudi, the wealth of our heritage. We're one generation removed out of a more sustainable way of life, as we've been reminded time and time again, and our shared sense of global community to design more resilient systems that are regenerative and have far more distributive economic structures, so that communities that are hit by all of these changes are more resilient when facing shocks. There's also a power to push and leverage crises, which we have not capitalized on, for change, a change that should be grounded in realism and hedging with a varied bag of both human-centric solutions and technological solutions, as well as knowing the limitations of said interventions. Progress could be cumulative, but only when circumstances allow it to be. So let's not take that for granted. Let's not assume that Professor Tad has finished to a certain point and will be continuing, or not, based on some of his points that he's made across. I'd just like to take this opportunity to really thank Iman, Natalia, Philip, and all of their colleagues. They've taken an important step to maintain this youth-led, youth-focused momentum to deliver on solutions. And thank you all who have stuck around. And yeah, good luck with tomorrow. And thank you for joining us. Feel better, Tad.
Yes, I will.
Off. Test. Okay. Thank you, Princess Mashail. Now we will have the tours around KAUST Research Centers, Core Labs, KAUST Museum of Science and Technology in Islam, and startup companies. These tours for the young change makers and for the impact supporters, you are free to have a break in this time. Okay, you can join the change makers also. And the tour will start now until 5:30. And the pickup and return point from here, building 20. And so please go ahead. And also please return the translation device if you have it outside. And we kindly remind you to share your journey with us on social media by using our hashtag. Thank you so much.
In the lobby, there will be volunteers with signs to the tours. So find the volunteer in the lobby with the tour that you're assigned to. Okay, wonderful. Enjoy.